It gives me great pleasure to speak to you this evening on behalf of St. Stephen's House, Oxford. I would like to thank Father Andreas for this very kind invitation to address you and to play my small part in the inauguration of the Institute of Sacred Music, Oxford, and its newly created graduate qualifications in worship and liturgical studies, the Common Awards postgraduate diploma and its corresponding master's degree. The invitation gives me an opportunity not only to listen to beautiful music and attend a wonderful evensong with you here in Oxford, but to consider your initiatives in the round and to ask some important questions about their interrelated purpose. Let's begin before we start, as it were. Let's begin with the idea of an Institute of Sacred Music and how the idea continues to create it once it exists. Let's begin with a fairly basic question. What is it? What exactly is an Institute of Sacred Music? Is it merely an academic framework for education and research, like other institutes, or is it more? An Institute of Sacred Music can, like other academic institutes, be home to many things: education, research, even community, broadly speaking. But there is, I believe, a palpable difference between an institute of sacred music and other academic institutes. The difference comes in the purpose of its creation. In other words, why it was created the way it was. Unlike other academic institutes, an Institute of Sacred Music has to be more than just an institutional framework for education and research. It has a spiritual obligation, and that obligation comes with one simple, if undeniably challenging, objective. An Institute of Sacred Music must also be what it represents, and what it represents is music. What exactly does it mean for something to be music, to be what it represents? And how can an Institute of Sacred Music actually be music? Augustine tells us unequivocally that God is music, that he is cosmic harmony itself, order in the very broadest sense, and that we as his creation are obligated to be what God is. Augustine scholar Carol Harrison puts it succinctly when she says that for Augustine, as for many other church fathers, music is written into the nature of created reality. But what does that mean exactly? How is music written into the nature of created reality? Music theologian Steve Guthrie, and my co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Music and Christian Theology, provides an answer. He says that being music is being in tune with God, being in harmony with God, being in the very beingness of God's order itself. There are other names for it. Another music theologian, Nathan Crawford, calls it attunement. Others call it, more prosaically, being in the groove. I call it groovy. Of course, as spiritual obligations, being in the groove, being groovy, being attuned, or simply being music applies as much to us as individuals as it does to the institutions we as individuals create. But institutes of sacred music have arguably an extra obligation because they not only create a place where music is, but where music is why it is. Institutes of sacred music, in other words, are created in the image of an idea that created them. They are created from music, to be music. And if they are music, they fulfill their obligation to be what they represent. Theologian Simon Oliver says that if God is the cause of creation, creation will express something of the character of God. I would suggest that if, as Augustine claims, God is music, and music is the cause of creation, then creation, in whatever form, human, institutional, will express something of the character of music itself. Again, how does that work exactly? How can we know when something expresses the very character of music itself? One way is by answering the question through the academic discipline of what I call music theology, and its use of the critically important preposition as. Building on Augustine and the Church Fathers, music theologians argue that if music is God, then we can interpret music as theology. Maeve Heaney encapsulates this in her seminal book called Music as Theology, What Music Has to Say About the Word. She asks, if theology is faith-seeking understanding, could music not also be theological? I would go further and ask not just whether music can be theological, but whether any theological action is in fact a performance of music. In other words, a performance of God's very being. And not simply a human performance that begins and ends, but a divine action that continues to create itself. At the beginning of this talk, I asked the question, what exactly is an institute of sacred music? Now we have an answer. I would suggest that the creation of an institute of sacred music is a theological action, and that as a theological action, it is a performance of music that continues to create itself. Your institute is, in other words, music theology in action. It is not only music as theology, but music theology itself. Theologian Jeff Astley might call this interpretation ordinary theology. In other words, theological interpretation that, in essence, reaches into the ordinary structure of our relatively ordinary lives. But it is, in fact, precisely the ordinary that is extraordinary, the theology that is music, and the music that is God. And an institute of sacred music is both ordinary and extraordinary because of that, because it emblemizes and embodies the very essence of what it is. And what it is tells us about what it means for us. And for your institute, what it means is more than just education and research. It means a community in harmony with its purpose, with its creator, attuned, in the groove, groovy, being what it is, being what it represents in the fullest sense of its creation. These characteristics seem appropriate for an institute with postgraduate programs in worship and liturgical studies, where theological wisdom is and can be enacted. The programs are themselves worship and liturgy, preaching and prayer, right down to the choice of modules, reflective practice, Christian worship, words and music in worship, Christian worship and human community, and so on. As common awards qualifications, these signal education that does exactly what the Latin etymology of education tells us it should, educare, literally to lead us out of ourselves into the harmonious order of God, recreating us, tuning us up, and leading us into the music. Being tuned up makes it sound like we're instruments. And indeed, we are. And so is an institute of sacred music. An institute of sacred music is precisely that. It is an instrument. And as an instrument, it must perform. It must praise its creator in everything it expresses. And it must love its performers in all that they bring. And as St. Paul says, we should sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. But an institute of sacred music is more. It is not just the singer of spiritual songs. It is also the song itself. If indeed, as Augustine says, God is music. Clement tells us more, in fact, that God is not only music, but the new song. In other words, Christ himself, forever creating us and recreating us and our work in his image, in the image of his undying love. You might say that it's a tall order to create anything that is what it represents, not least something as challenging as an institute of sacred music. But as someone who has worked hard to create similar organizations, I know it can be done. And St. Stephen's House is definitely the right place to do it. It understands its obligations and its purpose and its meaning. It understands its own unique music theology. And I hope I can be part of its music theology in future and help St. Stephen's achieve all the success it so rightly deserves. I wish you well in your endeavor, and warmest congratulations to you and your community on an especial achievement and accomplishment. Thank you.